So Kate, you've been discussing ways of moving children forward in their learning, specifically Key Stage 2, I believe, while still maintaining their interest and enthusiasm. Tell me your secret, because that must be such a hard thing to do.
I think, the secret to understanding how to move children on is probably referring to the Key Stage 2 framework for languages, which sets out for each skill area, sets out what the progression should be from year 3 to year 6. So that's a really good reference point for people if they're worried that the children are not actually progressing the right way. So essentially children begin by copying simple words and maybe learning to write some of them from memory, and then progress on to phrases and sentences and eventually text. So that's basically the progression. But obviously within that, in order to write sentences, children need to be taught grammar, obviously. So it's a question of really prioritising what grammar is appropriate to teach at primary level, what's manageable within the constraints of the curriculum and the time you've got and so on. Prioritising really.
How do you still maintain their interest and their enthusiasm with this subject while still obviously having to move them on along this structural path?
I think it's one thing that I think is important at primary level is as far as possible teaching French within the context, or whatever language it is, might not necessarily be French, but I teach French, so teaching French within the context of the other curriculum areas that children are studying. So for example, if their topic for the term is the Romans, then to try and find some way of incorporating French into teaching about the Romans. And personally I do it in the context of the French cartoon character Asterix. And depending on the age and level of French that the children already have, maybe they would describe the characters in terms of what they look like or what they're wearing or what sort of people they are in the story, or they might describe some of the action of the stories so that they're using verbs and so on. So I think that's one way of maintaining their interest. If they can incorporate it in other areas of the curriculum, I think that really helps. But apart from that, I think it's a good idea to just try and do things that are intrinsically interesting, that are not just writing for writing's sake. So if your writing can be writing to an interesting audience, for example, to children in a school in France or something like that, that automatically makes it interesting. You know, just writing about yourself is not very interesting. But if the person who receives that writing about yourself is somebody in another country, that changes things. Or if that's not possible, writing which involves some element of play. So, for example, you can use dice. Maybe you can have a sentence which has got a choice of different endings to it. So the beginning's always the same, but the ending's always different. And you can have maybe 6 different endings, and according to the throw of the dice, you write the ending. Okay, so even though all you're doing is copying the beginning of the sentence and the end of the sentence, it's kind of fun because there's an element of chance in it. Or writing words or sentences on cards to make a pairs game, or anything which just makes it fun. The other thing which I've found really, really useful is there's a very inspirational languages teacher called Claire Seacombe who runs a blog. It's called Changing Phase, and on that blog you can have access to a whole load of ideas of making mini books, and they're really, really creative ideas, different kinds of mini books to do with lifting the flap and folding in certain ways, and making 3D models and things like that. And I think that, again, that appeals to some children, the sort of creativity of it as well. It's not just writing, it's making a book, it's creating something. So yeah, I think it's about thinking your way round motivating children,
And
not
coming to
just
something-
worksheets.
Come to something like this, you're able to share those ideas, and for the teachers it must be invaluable to be able to literally hear that and think, that is such a good idea, I wouldn't have even thought about that. Have you had feedback from any of the delegates today, just saying, how they sort of felt about your workshops? And
Yes, a lot of people have been very appreciative and thought it would be very useful. But I know that in the past, including the ideas I just said about Claire Seacombe, who is the master of the mini book, if you like, or the mistress of the mini book. A lot of the ideas that I use, I've gathered because I've been teaching primary for 10 years now. So a lot of the ideas that I use I've built up over the 10 years, and they've been other people's ideas very often. So by going to conferences like this and training sessions like this, that's where you get those ideas, isn't it? And you may only use one or two of them, but you add it to your repertoire, and then over the years you build up a good bank of ideas. So yeah.
Now, talking of ideas, you incorporate ideas on teaching phonics, grammar and dictionary skills, as well as providing cross-curricular examples of foreign language composition. Now, I understand this can be used for a variety of languages. I know you're a French teacher, but this can go across a variety of languages. Most
of the ideas are completely transferable from one language to another. Obviously, when you're talking about grammar, when I'm talking about grammar, the examples I use are from French, and many of those ideas are transferable to other European languages. I think if people are teaching non-European languages, the grammar and the script can be so radically different that when you're talking about writing, maybe you need to make different emphases. But this morning, certainly, the only languages that people were teaching were French, German, or Spanish, and I think those languages have enough in common for the ideas to be transferable mostly.